And thank you very much to Ian and Jacqueline. Would you like to join us out the front? Because there's sure to be questions. I know I've got questions as usual. But anybody else have questions for any of the three speakers in our final session? Andrew.
Can I start with a question for Daryl?
Indeed.
Daryl, could you just explain the organisation of the pentropic, whatever it is?
Yeah, I'll go over it again, Andrew.
No. In terms of, there were different Allied prisoners.
Oh, yes.
And there was another Australian.
Yeah, sure. There were British prisoners, there were Indians, there were Gurkhas, there were the Australians, all kept in separate sections. You remember that photograph that we saw earlier on today? They were kept in separate sections. And the Indians and the British didn't always know that the Australians were there. The Australians, again, only found out after a long period of time there were actually other Australians there. They didn't know. And in fact, no one knew that there was yet another Australian. And he'd been one of those air liaison guys with the Chindits in the RAF, in the Chindits, and he'd been captured much earlier on one of the Chindit expeditions, and he also was in the jail. But the Australians didn't know until 1946 that he'd actually been there. Such was the solitary confinement. Is that okay? No,
Yeah,
thank you.
Just read the book, Andrew.
It's available for sale.
Now I've got a question for Jacqueline. The photographs you showed us, clearly that group of women in the portrait were Europeans. The Wakai, the Indian equivalent of the Wasbies, they accepted Anglo-Indians. What about the Wasbies?
Yes, there were some local women recruited. I didn't research into those. I just focused on the Australian women. But there was a real mixture of women, mainly British, of course, some Australian, Canadian, and some of the locals as well.
Anyone else? David?
Were there any similar units in other theatres that Australians were involved in?
There was an Australian equivalent, Women's Auxiliary Service India, but I'm not sure if there was any Australian women in there. But it's quite unique, isn't it? These mobile food bands. You sort of think there was a mess hut where men were fed through all theatres of war, and to have women behind the front line in lovely little dresses with their hair in turbans, it's quite unique. I don't know if anyone else here knows if that took place on any other continent, any other theatres of war.
Question for Daryl. There was evidence that the Japanese were planning on executing all prisoners of war at the end of the war. Any evidence to suggest that that was what they were planning in Burma?
No, I've come across no evidence to suggest that, although the treatment was pretty harsh. It doesn't appear to have been that way. Most of the frontline Japanese guards left, as I said, they left on the 29th or whatever, and they were, because they could see the way the war was going and they just wanted to get out. By this stage there were 800 or 900 prisoners, so from a mechanical perspective it might have just taken them too long to complete that task, so they wanted to get away as quickly as I can. And the soldiers who were left were like your dad's army of Rangoon, who were brought in to look very fierce, but they were not very fierce at all, hence they disappeared as quickly as they could as well.
Could I add a couple of points to that? I'm, as Andrew knows, collaborating with a Singaporean researcher, and he asked me a similar question the other day, and we came to two conclusions. The first was that it's very hard to speak of the Japanese because they were so every area, every command, every commander, every unit behaved differently. There was no uniform response. And the other point that we agreed on was that the belief that there was a kill the prisoners order sent out in July 1945 appears not to be the case. That there were some prisoners reported that they'd been told that the Japanese in Malaya, the ones who were working across the straits from Singapore, some of them said, "Oh, we knew the Japs were going to kill us," and they detailed the method. but it doesn't seem to have been a uniform thing. So ironically, although they treated them, as Daryl says, appallingly brutally, they didn't appear to have a plan to eliminate them all.
So what about Santa Cat then?
Ah, well, again, you see, that's in one place, and they, in that, you know, the 37th Army in North Borneo had to march them across, but the order was to march them across, but the executions happened at the instigation of relatively junior NCOs and officers on the track. So it's completely inconsistent. Bill?
I can comment on that. There was a film made on Fraser Island, and the film was about the raid that the Americans set up in the Philippines, the American Rangers, and probably for propaganda purposes, but not known to me. Could have been, but the fact was that...
What film made during the war?
No, a film made well after the war, about 20 years ago.
Oh, okay.
On Fraser Island.
Right.
But in any event, typical American sort of film. John Wayne wasn't in it, not that typical. But the fact is, it described the attack on this prisoner of war camp, I think east of Manila. I'm not sure the pronunciation, Kwambalitang or a name like that. And it was said that the commanding officer of the prisoner of war camp had issued instructions that all the prisoners would be killed, and it went to the extent of the prisoners digging trenches and so forth, and then they saw jerry cans of gasoline and so forth. So that was that situation, but no one's mentioned yet the influence that the Japanese had over the Formosan people, now Taiwan, and the Koreans, because Korea was an occupied territory of Japan for about 100 years. They murdered the monarchy and took it over as a slave state. And the Korean and Formosan guards, well, according to a cousin of mine who was an older cousin, was on the Burma Railway, he said they were the worst of all because the Japanese private soldier was giving them a belting if they didn't do what they wanted. So you can imagine how tough they were.
In another theatre, my father-in-law was a aircrew captured prisoner of Germans, and after the war, or after the German guards left, the prisoners went to their files, and he pulled out his file, and there, signed by Goering, was the order for him, because he was aircrew, to be done away with. And a photograph which didn't look like him at all, made him look like a criminal. And he didn't like us. I said, you look like a bit like a criminal, father-in-law.
Mike?
Daryl, were there any war crimes tribunals hearings resulting from Rangoon?
Not that I'm aware of.
There should have been, shouldn't there?
Yes, there should have been. Oh, yes, there were, weren't there? Because the guy Edmonds, who is the Australian who was discovered, in 1946 or so, went back, and there were war crimes trials in Rangoon. But that's about as far as I've got.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yes, absolutely.
A question of Ian. You mentioned in the chatting before that there was an athlete, a runner, also in Burma. What about any other sports? I know traditionally cricket and footy were the main sports, but any other sorts of sports there?
Well, I endeavoured to find other cases. I'm sure there are others that I haven't, and obviously some of these, as you'd be aware, both Harley Stillman and Pup Raymond came through work that Daryl and Andrew had done and then informed me about. I am aware of, I checked all the Olympians who were in the 1936 Olympics. A number of them were in the forces, but I don't believe in Burma. I know John Bromwich, the tennis player, served in New Guinea, but again, I'm not aware of Davis Cup tennis players who were in Burma, but I'm quite sure there are others that we hadn't found. That the initial look was cricketers and what cricket activities there were, and it just happened. There's a book, The Fallen, written by David Allen and Jermaine David's a fellow NCC Melbourne Cricket Club Library volunteer, and going through his book is where I found that Regan had served and died in Burma. So I'm sure that. Well, the runner is someone that Andrew picked up, and I've forgotten the guy's name now. But the guy who was the runner.
Yeah, I can't think of it.
No, he a Melbourne guy, competed in athletics. It's sort of made out in the newspapers that he'd be an automatic selection if the 1940 Olympic Games had taken place. I think that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but obviously he was quite talented, and yeah, eventually served in Burma. So.
Yeah.
Ian, whilst you're there, this doesn't particularly relate to Burma, but you were talking about cricketers playing cricket in England and so forth. When was Keith Miller playing?
Right, so Keith Miller was a member of the Australian Combined Services 11. Obviously he played a lot. There were a lot of games organised in England, and I believe that a lot of them at Lords. And Sir Pelham Warner, noted cricketer and then the manager of the Bodyline Tour, 32-33, he I think was in charge in organising those games. And as I said, actually in the Don Ross captained the RAAF team against the RAF in 1942. He also played in a similar match in 1943. I found a photograph of that. Miller is in that team, plus a number of the other combined services players. And for Victorians, I also noted, if you remember World of Sport, Bruce Andrew, who played for Collingwood, used to do the champion kick. He's in that team as well. Yeah, there was a lot of, and I'm sure Lindsay Hassett played cricket while he was in the Middle East and whatever, and I know games were going on in New Guinea and so forth. So Miller hadn't played tests. That's really where he made his name. He had played for Victoria, later played for New South Wales. So yeah, he really made his name through the victory tests and playing for the.
Would you like to comment on his comment about pressure?
Yes, we know that one. I think Miller played in India, and apparently it was quite the festival of Keith Miller through India. I don't think there was much of anything left in India by the time he left, and I think it was, look out Indian ladies, we're playing cricket in India. Thank you very much. He had a great time.
Yeah, I think he enjoyed himself, although the tour was quite difficult, and I don't think that the players, they start off playing against England, then they're told they've got to go to India and Ceylon, then they come back and have to play against all the Australian state teams. So they start off in sort of May 1945, and they're still going in February 1946.
What was happening?
When they flew back to Australia, they couldn't get transport. They ended up flying back on the floor. They had to sit on the floor of a Liberator liner to get back. Thank you very much.
Well, for those who don't know, he was asked about the pressure of opening the batting, and he said opening the batting isn't pressure, having a Messerschmitt up your backside is pressure. He was a fighter pilot.
Peter, then Bill.
Yeah, this is just a little bit off topic. Aung San, who was assassinated in 1947, what was the attitude of the British when they recaptured Burma toward the wartime activities?
I think Aung San was in very much, who headed up the Burmese National Army. I think he was sort of in the same camp as Chandra Bose with the Indian National Army, where you rebelled against us during the war, etc., etc. Bose was killed unfortunately in an aircraft crash early on, and the INA just sort of fell apart. I think it's sort of lost in the British wanted to get Burma back, but at the same time they acknowledged that there was a Burmese, nationalist movement coming, and I think they probably didn't want to try and inflame things too much in that regard. They were treading a fine path, and the Americans, weren't very happy in one sense to be seen to be aiding an empire and gaining back its vassal states.
Bill.
Not quite on this subject, but it might be entertaining to hear this little vignette. A man who belonged to the 39th Battalion, which was a Choco battalion went to New Guinea. Kokoda track. I'm summarising this. He was a captain, and he was thought to have been killed in action. So the Chocos withdraw. The regular army comes up through their lines and takes their position. And as they're sort of sweeping the area, they find what they thought was a body. Discover the body was alive. So recovered the man, got him down to Moresby, flew out of Moresby back to Australia, probably Darwin or Rockhampton or somewhere like that, and then flew him to Heidelberg. He's recovered in Heidelberg, badly wounded, bayoneted many times, shot, an eye missing, but recovered sufficiently, had gone to Wesley College, someone mentioned that earlier, and he played for Melbourne in what was then the VFL. So anyway, he goes out to the MCG as a member of the MCC to watch a game of presumably football. So someone points out, oh look, his name was surname Butler, G.J.D. Butler, and he said, look, Butler, your name's up on the honour board. And Butler's got the eye patch on, he's trying to feel. He said, well, what's it say? He said, you're dead. And Butler said, well, this I cannot put. He said, fetch the secretary. So the secretary's come down and, look, Butler, I understand you want to see me. That's right, secretary. He said, what's this about? He said, well, I'm told my name's on the killed in action. He said, I don't like it. He said, Butler, you're a nuisance. He said, what do you expect me to do about that? He said, well, secretary, you're the secretary. He said, you've got to do something about it. So the secretary's thought for him. He said, look, Butler, he said, what about if we make you a life member with no fee? Butler said, you don't.
And you're absolutely right, Bill. It wasn't relevant in the slightest.
No, absolutely right. I made that clear.
Carl Jones with a real question.
Thanks, Ben. I have a question for you, Jacqueline. Like, traditionally, it's tricky to recover women's history. Also, in the military settings, we always tend to privilege combat units. And then to add another difficulty on top of that, trying to follow Australians who serve in British units is also quite challenging, particularly remotely. How did you go about recovering these women's stories?
Thank you.
Good question.
Thanks, Carl. Well, good old Trove. I think someone mentioned that earlier, Megan. And Andrew was a bit of a whiz at finding different articles. Say Carleen Reid had returned home to Hobart. So it would make the local newspaper in the more of the social section, and it would mention that she was, over with the Wasbies, or someone was getting married and then going to join her husband, follow her husband over to active service, that sort of thing. So even less information on the local women, but they were mentioned. But yeah, Trove was a good one, and there was the British file, the manila folder about that bit. Not a lot of detail. It was more debating. And what else do we have, Andrew? We had...
Well, you had your personal contacts with the descendants.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sorry, descendants of some of the Wasbies. So I had found one, and then they had put me out to the daughters of other Wasbies. So family legend and archives as well. Yeah, it's sort of unofficial records of finding them, but nothing really in the formal memorial or shrine.
Just following that up, this is a really good question. But how to put this? That if you conducted interviews with these women, if you'd done this project 20 years ago,
Yes.
and you'd spoken to them face to face,
Yes.
do you reckon you would have learned things that you didn't get from Trove and from the official record of the British Library?
Well, there probably would be explanations out of how some of the 12 Australian women found their way over. And also there were a number of books written. So Ninian Taylor's daughter and granddaughter wrote a book about her role. And the reason I think they didn't, excuse me, they didn't access the British Library file is that there was information in the file that wasn't in their book. So that's what I'm thinking, it may not have been ever opened. But there was a couple of books written, say, by nieces or daughters or granddaughters about what their woman in their family had done as a Wasbie. So I went through a couple of those books, and there was historical fiction written as well. So, yeah, there was even one book called Ticket to Burma that's only in the State Library. That's where I found the quote about the soldiers saying that they were real women. You know, so I just went through sort of more memoir accounts rather than official documentation.
But all of that stuff, sorry to keep going on this, but all of that stuff would have been produced, let's see, like, do you think they told a real story? I mean, it's just inconceivable. Several thousand women amongst this enormous army. Did any of them say, gee, it was frightening, or wow, you know, I had an experience of being molested or whatever?
Well, the Ticket to Burma book, I felt that the author, she was a Wasbie, it was written firsthand. She was almost quite racist and judgmental. She talked about the African soldiers putting shoe polish on their biscuits, and you think, well, that would have been one, but she was making out generalisations as if they were all doing it, sort of thing. Yeah, but you sort of had to interpret. But we couldn't find any information really much about Bernice Lowry, the woman who was killed in the Jeep accident. She was over there. Her husband was, what's the word? A plantation manager, a planter. We couldn't find much about her death. And obviously her death certificate would be in Myanmar now, so we couldn't find much about her. I found more about her backstory as a World War I nurse, and obviously there's a service record on that, but nothing about how she got to Burma, or the file in the British Library wasn't complete in terms of passenger lists, and some women who left from here, there's really no official documentation. There was the one voyage, HMS Otranto, that Elsa and Mary were on. There's really only passenger lists for that ship, but it's not fully complete.
Another for Jacqueline.
Yeah, Brahma.
Yeah, I think the missionaries that played a major role in that part of the war. Okay, is 1853. The Congregation of Holy Cross is coming in part of Chittagong, normally the Burmese that's part, and they play actually the major role for everything. The social reform, the connections, even my school headmaster, the Brother Flavian Lockman, and he will be sent very soon. That he's canonized already. He beautified and ready for canonization. He played a major role in the Burma Railways in action in Chittagong, and he basically someone here I mentioned the supporting is the war effort, and missionaries that set up in a relief organization supporting the community, even supporting the British military. So they played a major role in the missionary activities, that particular part.
So the missionaries wouldn't be well documented either.
Yes, that's you can find out there, sure.
Sure.
And they've got records.
Jacqueline, I'm interested in the status of women's services, generally speaking, and certainly in the Second World War, but also in the First World War, there's always a problem of the recognition. You mentioned, for example, that some of the Wasbies were commissioned. Was that accepted by the military authorities?
Commissioned as in, that would have been Ninian Taylor, Lower St John, just the leaders. I think there was a couple that reached sergeant rank, but they were paid in rupees, 120 a month in rupees. I'm not sure how that equates. I think.
Did Ninian Taylor have a rank?
Yeah.
Was she commissioned?
Yep.
Yes. It's in my chapter there next to you, Andrew, what she ended up being. Lieutenant.
She was a lieutenant colonel.
Lieutenant colonel, thank you. But I didn't hear that and then some of the other women were sergeant, which is really confusing because they're civilians within the army, but they did make sergeant rank. The lady who stood there with the band.
That transition from a lot of the auxiliary services start out as civilian and then taken over by the army, and it's a very difficult interaction between those two stages. Whether it's AWAS, Women's Land Army, or any of the other auxiliary services.
That's right, it's odd, isn't it? Because I had course look at the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the UK ranks, and they're not wing commanders and all the rest of it. They're section officers, and they've got a different rank name because they're not real flight lieutenants. They're section commander type things. So being accepted as having the authority of a commissioned rank.
And there's a flow-on from the same experience in the First World War.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and Australian nurses in the First World War they're honorary officers, aren't they? That's right. So it's all about authority. Oh,
I was just going to say exactly what you just said. That there were honorary officers during the First World War. All nurses had access to the officers.
Yeah.
mess, and I imagine that's a similar situation that's happened here for the Wasbies. To be a sergeant, the sergeants have a separate mess that's above the ordinary ranks as an NCO.
So it would be interesting to see if those commissions were actually signed.
By the king, yeah.
The First World War nurses only got a commission once they made sister. If they were a nurse, they weren't commissioned.
I thought in the Second World War, the First War, I don't think any of them were commissioned, were they?
Well, they certainly.
They didn't wear pips, did they? In the First World War? Anyone know?
Well, they were referred to. I'm sure that once they made sister, they were treated as officer.
Right. Oh, treated, yeah.
Yeah,
Treated but not commissioned.
But if you were a nurse, you were in the ranks.
Yeah, yeah. Well, scope for more research anyway. More questions? Oh, we may have run our course, in which case we'll ask you to thank our three Dunleavy. And that means that, to everyone's relief, that's enough from me for today.